Greetings from the Tech Cave. Fenris here, and today I have in front of me a package from China. Now, this little device right here I encountered while browsing Aliexpress, and it's a device that I've wanted to look at for quite some time, but the only reason why I haven't was because due to its price, and also because I own devices like this already, I didn't see any urgency to do so. However, recently I held a little Twitter flash sale in order to raise funds for the Analog 3D, and not only did I raise those funds, but I was also able to smash that goal entirely and have some extra funds for things like, various projects that I can turn into videos. And I figured, you know what, why not? Let's purchase this device and make it a video. So, without further delay, let's unwrap this interestingly wrapped package, shall we? Alright, and as you can see in front of me, what we have here is a completely reshelled Super Famicom. Now, when it came to purchasing options, there were two: integrated sound and independent sound. Now, integrated sound was just going to be completely random. It was going to be anywhere between a GPM revision motherboard up to like maybe a one chip, but I wasn't going to test my luck with it being a one chip, especially for the price that it was at. This was the cheaper of the two, which is labeled as independent sound. And what that means is it's guaranteed to be an SHVC CPU 01, which is fine because this is the board revision that I personally prefer. Now, I hope that they got these boards out of like really jacked up looking Super Famicoms. If they used like some pristine condition, that would be kind of bad, but there's some evidence that suggests that they did not. And looking at the chipset here, we have what looks to be a 213 revision, a revision 2 CPU, a revision 1 PPU, and a revision 3 PPU 2. And that's the most common revision, so that's kind of expected. I kind of wish that we got like a 111 revision, which is the one that I like, but I'll take what I can get. And to be honest, this shell does look really nice. I mean, there is some issues from like 3D printing, but that can be smoothed over. I really like the design of this. So yeah, this is a really slick machine, and the dust cover just popped out. But yeah, that's why I was kind of like hesitant when purchasing it, because technically I own a lot of Super Famicoms, so I didn't need this. This is just really neat, and you know what? It would make for a really neat video. Although one issue that I can see right off the bat now that I remove the dust cover, and you're not going to be able to see this on camera, but they did not replace the capacitors on this, which that is a problem, because the capacitors on these Super Nintendos, or Super Famicoms in this case, are starting to vent. So I'm definitely going to have to crack this open and address that issue. And I can also see that they did have to cut a little bit of the sound module just to get this to fit, which is, it's not great, but if it works, it works. But in any case, what I'm curious about is, does this even work? They do say that all of them are tested, but I'll be the judge of that. So let's get the camera down and let's see if this works. All right, we got it all hooked up here, and you know the drill at this point. We got RGB SCART all hooked up, and as you can see, we're gonna switch over to SCART RGB, and we're just gonna hit it with the burn-in test cart just to make sure the hardware works. So let's fire it up, and that's looking promising. We do have CPU activity according to the timer. I can control it. Let's hit that burn-in. Pass. It's passing. And pass. All right, it seems to pass all the tests. Flick off the power. We're going to select composite video, just to make sure that works. We got composite. And then we're going to switch over to S video. We got S video. So at the very least, the board is still good. We're just going to need to change out those capacitors in order to prevent any damage to it. So we're just going to switch over to discard RGB real quick, and we're going to test out some games. So pop this out. We're going to pop in some Super Mario Kart just to make sure the Mode 7 is actually good. All right, the Mode 7 seems to check out. Plug in some Donkey Kong Country just to make sure the CIC is working. Yeah, seems to be working. And now for expansion pin games with Star Fox 2. That's good. And of course, we can't be testing Super Nintendos or Super Famicoms without Kamen Rider. And that seems to be working too. So yeah, with all intents and purposes, the hardware does work, so that's great. But given the fact that the capacitors weren't changed out and most likely the stereo fix wasn't even applied, we're going to crack this thing open anyways and do some fixes to it. And in addition, I might add a little bit of extra flair to the unit, if you will, just to really make this system really stand out. So without further delay, let's get this system apart and do some fixes. So looking over the system here, it appears that the best way of accessing the internals of the system would be to remove these 4 screws here. Now, once I remove these screws, I have to carefully lift the plate up and disengage the power switch here, because the power switch is screwed to the top plate here, and really I don't want to have to unscrew it if I can avoid it. So let's just remove these 4 screws, disengage the power switch, and work on also getting the motherboard free from the shell. Okay, so looking over the unit, it seems that where the top screws would normally go, they are held down with these little nuts here, well, plastic nuts to be exact, and the bottom shell is where the screws for these go. Now, I'm not going to remove the screws from the bottom due to the fact that I don't want to have to like put these all back together, you know, make sure they're all aligned, just to make sure that I can seal this unit back up. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use a 5.5mm ratchet bit and just unscrew them from the top like so. That way I can keep these screws intact where they are, and I can just simply lift the board out. So actually I should also remove the sound module, and as you can see, that's where they cut the corner out just to make sure it would fit right here. But regardless, I'm just going to go ahead and remove the rest of these nuts so that way we can free the board. Sorry about all that. This thing was really not budging out, and it turned out that the little back screw here just was elevated too high, and as a result I couldn't really safely pull the board out from the front, so I had to loosen this screw just to make sure that the board would be free. And it's a good thing I decided to free the board, because just looking at it, this thing is like really dirty. Like, that's dust right there. So evidently they didn't even clean the board. I do see that they actually did recap the board, which is nice, but given the fact that the board is really dirty and I don't really trust the quality of the surface mount caps, I'm just going to go ahead and replace the caps anyways and give this system a nice little tune up. So let's break down the system the rest of the way. Alright, now that we got all the metal bits out of the way, we can now proceed to removing the caps and the regulator, which is as simple as 1, 2, 3. So now that we got all the old caps out of the way, we can now clean this board up and install some fresh caps, and we're going to be doing one extra modification to this that's going to really make it shine. So let's keep going. Okay, so now that I got the board all cleaned up, this board is basically ready for a recap, which I'm not going to bother showing that process, mainly because I've already covered it in the past. But there is something that I did cover in the past that I am going to make note of now, and it's mainly because I did a poor job at covering it last time, and that involves these two traces right here. Now, if you recall from my Super Nintendo restoration video, I noted how these two traces were eroded and to a point where they were not only not connected with each other, but not connected to the other side of the board. But I did a really poor job explaining at how I went about testing to make sure of that. So what I have here is I have my multimeter set to diode mode, and it is active. So what we're gonna do is take our probes, make sure that the multimeter is active. It is. And we're just going to test these pads. So first order of business is testing the pads themselves. So we'll put one probe on one pad and the other on the other. That's good. That's good. Now we're going to take one of the probes and put it on the pad. Actually, let's do this one and take the other probe and probe the via that they go to. So in C59 and C60's case, it's this little via right here. That's good. And in the case of C58 and C57, there's a little via right here. So that's good. Now, let's make sure that the vias are making it to the other side. So first order of business is figuring out where they go. So we're going to put one probe on one of the vias, and we're going to figure out where it goes. So that's the via for C59 and C60, which should go up to R42 here. And it does. So, final test for these pads is we're going to put one probe on one of the pads, C59 or C60, it doesn't really matter. Make sure I get this in frame. And we're going to probe R42. And we have continuity on the other side. So we can confirm that these two pads are good. Now let's figure out where this via goes. So, should be right here. And it should connect to R33. And it does. And to double check, we're gonna probe one of the pads here. I'm sorry if I'm kind of like all over the place. It's a little difficult for me to film. And we've confirmed that R33 is connected. So we have confirmed that all 4 of these pads are good. It's just that the silk screening here is a little eaten away. So now that we've confirmed that the pads are good, we can then move forward with recapping the board. And if you ever see pads that look like this, check them. Like, don't even think about it, just check them to make sure that they are good. That way you're not going back and having to do patchwork. So without further delay, let's move forward. Okay, so our main board is fully recapped, so all we really need to do now is some work on the underside. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be installing some 100 microfarad 16 volt capacitors along C90, C91, C92, C93, C94, and C95. And as well, we're going to be replacing C81 with a 22 microfarad X5R ceramic cap in order to perform the vertical bar fix. And one extra little thing is we're going to be removing the back plate here because, as you can see, the back plate is a bit yellowed. So we're going to be replacing it with a much cleaner one just so that way it looks nicer. And we're also going to be replacing the front plate of the controller board here for similar reasons. But in addition to the controller board, we're also going to be removing this LED here, and that will come into effect once we get to the final stages of the reassembly. Really, the only other thing, oh yeah, and we're also going to be installing the 78SO5, which I already have bolted to the heatsink. But really, the only thing that we're not going to be doing that I used to do in previous videos is install the 470 microfarad capacitor that comes with a cap kit. And the reason why is it was discovered by Voltar that when you install this capacitor, there is a chance of it discharging a larger load onto the system itself, which could potentially fry something. Now, if you already have this capacitor installed, you can install a diode between the input and output sides of your regulator, so that way it forces it to discharge to ground. But, you know, the fact of the matter is we shouldn't be installing these capacitors anyways, so it's better to just forego this capacitor and, you know, just install the regulator as is. So without further delay, we are going to move on with installing the rest of the parts, and yeah, we will then move on to the next stage, which is adding an RGB LED strip. So let me get those parts installed and we'll move on to that. Okay, and with that, I have all of my 100 microfarad capacitors installed, the 22 microfarad capacitor installed in C81, I got the 78SO5 soldered in, and as well, the back panel has been changed out. And just to show again, this is the old one and here's the new one. So yeah, quite the difference if you ask me. So with that, the main board is basically done, but we're not done with the soldering iron yet, because next we're going to be working on the sound module. Now, given the fact that it has been slightly modified so that way it can fit in the case, in addition to the necessary fixes, that being a capacitor replacement and the stereo fix, I'm going to change out the shell with a new set that I pulled from my parts bin. Now, you may be wondering, well, why not just get a new sound module that looks nicer? Well, I could do that, but then I'd have to do this little notch thing to that, and I'd rather not have to do unnecessary mods like that. So for the sake of time and for the fact that this already had the work done for me, I'm just going to go ahead and remove the old shell and install it into the new shell. So let me show you how I go about doing that. So the first order of business is cracking this open. And much like with the Super Famicom restoration video, all I'm going to do is just take this screwdriver here and twist. And as you can see, it lifts the shell as I twist it. Now be careful, you don't want to go too fast because you could cut yourself by accident with a flathead screwdriver, which would not be pleasant. But if you're patient and you go at a reasonable pace, you should be able... Oops. One side decided to clip down. But you should be able to extract it cleanly. And in order to remove it wholesale, all we need to do is desolder these ground tabs here, and it should lift out. So let's bust out the soldering iron, reflow those pads, and get them desoldered. Okay, so now that we have all the ground pads and as well as the capacitors and the little crystal here desoldered, let's try to see if we can extract it. So if we did it right, these tabs should be able to bend back. Let me see if I can get a spudger. Yep, there we go. Now normally you shouldn't use plastic on metal because you're going to ruin the plastic spudger, but I got plenty of these laying around. And look at that. Everything came out buttery smooth. So now we can work on the sound module and install it back into the new shell. Okay, so I have the fresh capacitors installed and I even have the stereo fix in place. So this board is ready to go. Now we're just gonna put it into the new shielding. So I got the cage of the shielding right here. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna flip it over and make sure that the tabs align in all corners. And it looks like it does. So we just click it on like so. And then we're gonna take the bottom shielding, click it on. It looks pretty good so far. And now we're just gonna solder all these tabs into place and put the top shielding on. So let's get to it. All right, and with that, we are done with the sound module. And as you can see from where we started, how it's going now is a lot better. So with that, we're basically done with the soldering for the Super Nintendo hardware. Now we're moving on to the final step, and that is installing an RGB LED strip into the case. Also, really quick, I did say that we were going to be tackling the controller ports, but I decided to just pull this out of my bin. It's one with a really good faceplate, but has the LED removed, and it has a nice little new PCB and ribbon cable. This is just one that I pulled from a Super Famicom replacement shell that I will be looking at in a future video, but I figured that since I already had the LED removed from it, I would just use this instead. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the RGB strips. Okay, so as far as the RGB LED strip that we're using, there's nothing really special about this one. This is just a cheap one that I purchased from a store called Five Below for like $5. But more importantly, this is a 5-volt powered LED strip. And the way that we're going to tackle this is we're going to cut it up and place 2 strips along the sides here. That way we have like a nice little glow from left to right. I would put it front and back as well, but there's not a ton of space to work with, so we gotta work with what we got. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to take this strip, measure it out, and see if I can get it to fit within the sides of this case. So give me just a moment. Okay, so the first order of business is testing our RGB LED strip. So I'm gonna take the controller board here and this little Molex connector, and I'm assuming that the arrow lines up with the B pad here. So we're just gonna plug it in. Then we're gonna go over to a USB port and, oh, yep, it's glowing. It's flashing through lights right now. That's why I had to pull it away. So let's see if I can just transform it into fade with the remote. There we go. And as you can see, our RGB LED strip is working. So yeah, we can now get this thing prepped for installing in the case. So looking at the case here, it looks like I can be able to fit 3 LEDs per side. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just going to line it up, come over with my trusty pair of scissors, and cut within the white line. So that's 1. And since we know that it's 3 columns for each side, I'm just gonna come in here with my scissors again and cut the other. So now we have our 2 strips to put on the left and right side of our case. Now we just need to prep the controller board. Okay, so in order to prepare the controller board, we need to free the controller board from this shrink tube sleeving here. So I'm just gonna come in with a tiny pair of scissors, and I'm just gonna carefully cut the shrink tubing. We just need enough to where I can get in and either rip the rest off or be able to cut it without damaging anything. We're getting it. Okay, so now that we got the sleeving removed, the next thing that we need to take care of is we need to remove the header connector here, the USB cable, and the diode here. We will not be using the headers or the USB cable, but keep the diode in nearby because we're going to be installing this onto our controller port here where the LED was. So let's get to removing. So next order of business is determining where exactly we're going to mount the controller board. Now, I want to make sure that it's not too far from either the first LED strip or the infrared diode. So the best place that I can possibly think of, given the orientation of things, is somewhere right here. Yeah, that looks about right, because once we come in with the PCB, there's like plenty of extra space down here to allow it to live. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some adhesive strips, just measure out a small chunk, cut the length, and we're just going to stick it right there. So give me just a moment. And yeah, somewhere like that should do fine. I didn't peel the other side just yet because I do have to install the wires, but if we come in with the PCB, yep, there's still plenty of room for it to wiggle around without it hitting the main PCB. So we should be good there. So let's get our wires installed and get the LED strips in. Sorry about that. My camera decided to just suddenly die on me while I was in the middle of filming. So, oh well. Well, I might as well just show you what I had gotten done. So I have the controller board all wired up here. I have just a short length of wire for the receiver and one of the LED strips. And you will also see that I have this other 4-pin conductor dangling out. And the reason why for that is we're going to be wiring it up to the other LED strip. But there is something that we need to do in order to expose the pads here, but we'll get to that when we get to that. And then finally, for power and ground, I have this little connector cable here. That way, when I reassemble everything, I could just plug it up with the main board. Like so. And as you can see, it is connected straight to the regulator here. That should be fine. But, you know, I'm not really like trying to advertise this as like, oh, this is the best way to do it. It's just more of me goofing around with an Aliexpress console. So yeah, just a little fun. So with that out of the way, let's get the other LED strip prepped up so we can wire it up. Okay, so the way that we are going to prep this is we need to actually cut down this little silicone layer that's protecting our RGB and 5-volt pads. Now, I could have used an LED strip that didn't have this little silicone layer on it. I just decided to go with this one mainly because it was available at the time, and plus the silicone layer acts as like a diffuser. So all we're going to need to do is come in with our X-Acto knife and cut down. We don't need to cut all the way down, just enough to where we can get the knife in. That feels about right. And then we're going to try to scrape it off. Cut a little. Scrape it off. This is the challenging part of working with these. Oh, looks like I got it. We want to make sure that we don't cut all the way through. And once we got the majority off, we're just going to come in with a soldering iron with the knife edge tip, and we're just going to burn off the rest. You'll know you're done when you can feel it making contact with the metal. Yep. All right, and once you take care of that, immediately clean your tip. You do not want to get junk on your tip. All right. And with that, we have our leads exposed. So now we can solder it up to our controller board. All right, and with that, we have the other LED strip soldered in. So now we can move on to the final stage, and that is reassembly. Okay, so first order of business is we need to reinstate that one screw post that was giving us a little bit of trouble earlier. So that's going to be this little screw right here. and this little long nut. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop it through that hole where it once was. And we're just going to thread our nut. Now, we just need it in place enough to where we can still slide in the board. We're not going to fully screw it in just yet. So let's get the board installed. Actually, let's first get the LED strips installed, and then we can mount the board. Okay, that was a lot more difficult than it needed to be, but I had to actually stop filming just to get the board in, because this little connector cable here that I installed specifically to make it easier on me turned out to make things a lot harder on me, because it kept trying to go under the extension port. It kept obstructing the capacitors that I installed underneath, so it was just being a pain in the butt, but eventually I was able to get it in. So with that, we can now finish reassembling the board, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually replace all the plastic nuts with proper M3 metal nuts, just so that way we can lock it in a little bit more firm. So let's get to it. Okay, 4 out of 5 nuts installed. We just need to install this little corner one here, which is going to be a little bit difficult to do by hand. So let's see if I can kind of... There we go, got it in with some tweezers. Then come in with my screwdriver and lock it in. There we go. So with that, it's fully secured. Now we just need to put the controller port in and we should be good. Okay, final round of testing. I have the burn-in test cart hooked up. I have the system hooked up to the RetroTing 5X via RGB SCART, and we're just gonna flick on the power. And as you can see, we are still working. Let's see if we could set this to fade. We can. All right, so we're just gonna run the burn-in test to make sure everything's okay. And we are going to do this in real time because I don't want to accidentally trigger like an epileptic episode just fast forwarding the footage. So we're just going to do this raw. All right, so the hardware works still. I almost unplugged the cartridge. Switch over to composite. Works over composite. Switch over to S video. Works over S video. Switch back to SCART RGB. Unplug the cartridge, and we're gonna plug in Super Mario Kart just to make sure the mode 7 actually works correctly. And as you can see, the RGB LED strip does not save its settings, so that's partially why we're doing this raw. I don't want this to be like any sort of epileptic seizure trigger. All right, mode 7 works. Test CIC functionality with Donkey Kong Country. All right, we're able to get into Donkey Kong Country. Test out expansion pin games with Star Fox 2. That works. And then rounding up with a bit of Kamen Rider. And Kamen Rider works. Okay, so final thoughts. So, I really like the way the case looks, and I do think the addition of the RGB LED strips does add a bit of extra flair to it that you won't see with most Super Nintendos. That being said though, do I think this is worth the 80 bucks? No. From the fact that the board was never cleaned, the questionable capacitors, I'm sure they were fine, but I just wasn't willing to risk it. And even more so, they didn't even bother changing the DC filter capacitor in the back or the reset capacitor in the front. So they didn't even do a full recap. They just did a partial one. But add to that the front controller port and the back panel were yellowed, and they gave me like a rusty old sound module. For $80, I kind of expected a little more from the experience. But that being said, though, I don't recommend it as like a serious purchase. But if you're just looking for a neat little centerpiece, you could do worse. You could also do better though as well. So take of that what you will. I will say the big advantage though is the fact that the entire board is intact. If I wanted to, I could always get a replacement Super Famicom shell and put it in there should something happen to the case. So at least it's got that going for it. But in any case, guys, if you liked what you saw, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, until the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.